Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be with you at this inaugural party and to share some of my own story with you. Obviously, it's going to be a bit condensed because of the time that we have, but I definitely want to extend to you the ways that God has worked in my own life and brought me to faith in Yeshua. So I grew up in a Jewish home. Both my parents were Jewish. Conservative home. My grandparents actually were Zionists, and I grew up on the North Shore for most of my life of Chicago. And just to give you a sense of who my grandparents were and what was important to them, my grandmother was the president of Hadassah in the Chicago area, which had a lot of Jews in the chapter. And she and my grandfather single-handedly, through their involvement with Hadassah, raised millions of dollars for the state of Israel long before I was even born. And so the names that floated around their house as I was growing up were personal friends of theirs, like Yitzhak Rabin, Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan. These were all people that they met as Israel was becoming a state. And so I grew up with a very, very strong sense of my identity as a Jew and began to go to synagogue and Hebrew school and Saturday school as soon as all those things became available to me. One of 4 children. I have an identical twin sister, a brother 2 years older, and a younger brother 4 years younger than myself. I can honestly say that growing up in the Chicago area, my life was all Jewish. I went to a Jewish school, lived in a Jewish neighborhood, had Jewish friends, and really didn't know any Gentiles, didn't really know very much about Christianity, and certainly didn't know anything about Jesus and who he was and what he taught. And that was because I grew up in an all-Jewish environment, but it was also intentional as well to protect my own Jewish identity, my grandparents and my parents. And so growing up as a very young child, I thought everyone in the world was Jewish because everyone in my world was Jewish. Well, as I said, I was in, we began to go to synagogue and Saturday school and Hebrew school to really learn about our faith. And my sister and I were bat mitzvah together. And, you know, for many Jewish kids was really kind of the culmination, but also in some ways the exit point, unfortunately for us in terms of our Jewish life, even though we had a very strong Jewish identity. Spiritually, where I think I was at that point was God seemed very irrelevant to me. He didn't seem personal. He didn't seem like he was involved in my life in a day-to-day personal way. Like many young people, young teenagers, I was bored with the idea of being in synagogue and hearing everything in Hebrew. And even though my identity as a Jew is very important to me, God was not personal and God was not relevant. And at that point, I really began to question if God did really exist and if the stories that I had grown up reading about in the Old Testament in the Tanakh were really true stories. So that's where I was, blossoming into a teenage girl at the age of 15. And at that time in my life, a family tragedy struck, which turned our family upside down. Without going into a lot of detail, because I don't have the time, the essence of it was my older brother, Mark, who was a freshman in college, was killed very suddenly and very violently in a car accident on his way home from school in the middle of December. And I remember as he was in the accident, I didn't know how serious the accident was. I remember actually taking a moment to turn my heart to God and to pray. And I can say that it was probably the most honest personal prayer up to that point that I ever prayed to God. And I said to God, if you're real and if you love our family, please save my brother's life. And moments after I prayed that prayer, we received the news that my brother had passed away. And so the next few days and weeks were really a blur, filled with tremendous grief. I didn't have a sense of the afterlife or knowing how to deal with death at all. I remember our home during the time when we sat Shiva was filled with many people coming with well wishes and food and prayers. And I remember just being filled with this intense anger and grief and a number of questions that I felt there were no answers to. And I specifically remember being at that Shiva time and going around to different people who were there, teachers and relatives and friends, and asking these burning questions inside of me. What happens when we die? Where do we go? Why do bad things happen to good people? Where is God in all of this? And after talking to several people, I was finally pointed to the one person I probably didn't really want to talk to, and that was the rabbi who was sitting in the room. And for me, as a 15-year-old girl, he looked like he could have been 100 years old. And I came to him and I posed all those questions. And he sat there quietly and he looked at me and he said, I'm not sure I know the answers to those questions, but I will pray that you find what you're looking for. And as you can imagine, that really fueled my anger even more, because I felt that if you who represent my faith to me don't have these answers, who does? And so I spent the next few years of high school really living in that cloud of grief, my parents unable to really care for us in an emotional way because they were dealing with grief themselves, and really prepared to just go from home so that I could pursue my own goals and my own dreams, knowing that life was short and I didn't know how much time I had, and certainly didn't believe there was anything beyond this life. And so I prepared to go to the University of Michigan because I knew it was a good school, and there were a lot of Jewish students there that I could connect with, because my identity was still very important to me. And so my sister and I, my identical twin, we went our separate ways for our first time, and I found myself at the University of Michigan rooming with someone that I didn't know, someone who was not Jewish. And I remember the first day, just a funny story, coming into the dorm room. She had already been there. Her side of the room was set up, and I remember she had a picture on her dresser. And I remember asking her if this was her boyfriend. I'm going to show you this picture here. This is the comic relief. So if you're there and you're laughing, feel free to do that. And she looked at me very strangely and she said, "You don't know who that is?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, that's Jesus." And then she said something even stranger. She said, "And he is my boyfriend." And so what I discovered about my roommate, Lori, was that she was a Catholic who had met Jesus, as she described it later, in a personal way, and come to really know him, and came to the University of Michigan really wanting to live her faith. Well, I didn't know what her faith was, and I didn't know who this man Jesus was, but she seemed nice enough, and so we began a friendship. And there was another girl in my hall who claimed the same thing, who claimed to know Jesus in a personal way. And again, she didn't tell me who this Jesus was, but there was something about these two girls and the way they lived their lives that I was drawn to. And I began to grow in friendship with them. We began to have the typical debates, Old Testament versus New, and I didn't know that much really to share with them, and they were just beginning to grow in their faith. So just fast forward a bit, that was my freshman year, continuing to grow in faith with them. There's a lot more to that story, but I want to take you all the way up to almost the end of that freshman year. It was the season of Lent, and I didn't know it was Lent, but looking back now, that's why this movie was being shown on TV. And a number of these girls, Lori and my friend Sarah, said, "Hey, do you want to take a study break? We're going to watch this movie." And so they didn't describe the movie. I just said, sure. So I went down into the lounge, a small carpeted room, and this was being shown on TV. It was going to be shown in 2 sessions. And very, very quickly, what I realized as the movie rolled out, that this was a movie called Jesus of Nazareth. And I immediately felt uncomfortable, felt I needed to leave the room, but I stayed, and I watched as this movie about Jesus unfolds. And I watched as in amazement. And I remember turning to my friend Sarah and saying, "He's Jewish. Jesus is Jewish." I never knew that. And as I watched this Hollywood version of Christ's life unfold, I felt drawn to the person of Jesus. And this is something only God can do. And I felt drawn to his Jewishness. I felt drawn to his character. I felt drawn to the way he loved people, to his passion and his conviction about who he was and what he came to do. And as the movie was ending that night, the first part of it, the scene unfolded where Jesus comes to the edge of a town and he's met there by a woman who is weeping. And she says to him, Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. And those were almost the same words that I had said to God on that night when my brother Mark had died. And immediately I wanted to just leave that situation because that grief in me was so, so profound. But I stayed and I watched as Jesus goes with Martha and Mary to the tomb of their brother Lazarus, who has been dead, who has been buried. And he goes there and he calls forth his friend Lazarus from the tomb and he raises him from the dead. And I sat there in astonishment and I thought, who is this man? Is he the one? Is he the Messiah? Is there someone who has a power over life and over death? And I went back to my room that night and I could not sleep. And I went down to my friend Sarah's room and I knocked on her door and she opened her door this wide, didn't say anything. And I didn't say anything to her. And she handed me her Bible, her personal Bible. And I opened it up and I began to read the Gospels for the first time, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I read the part where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall never perish, but the one who believes in me shall live forever. And that night I prayed for a second time and I said, God, I don't know who you are and I don't know who this man Jesus is, but give me the faith to believe. And I began to read the scriptures every night for 9 months. I began to read the Gospels and to see who Jesus says he was. I began to compare it to the Old Testament prophecies in Isaiah and other places. And I began to really study the scriptures. Fast forward, and I'm going to kind of wrap this up really quick, although there's a lot more to the story. A number of months later, my sophomore year, I'd been praying that prayer for 9 months. And in October of that year, or November, I had a dream. And in that dream, I saw a man standing before me saying, who do you say that I am? And I couldn't see his face because it was dark. And then a second and a third time, he called out to me, who do you say that I am? And the third time I saw the face of Jesus, Yeshua, standing before me. And I said, you're Jesus, you're the Lord. And through that dream and through that revelation and through that encounter with scripture, God began to give me the gift of faith to acknowledge that he was really the Lord of my life. And so I gave him everything. I gave him permission to be the Lord of my life. And I really, that year, began to grow in my faith as a disciple of Yeshua. And to make a very long story short, I continued on that path and met my husband and continued to grow in my faith as a disciple. And as I entered the Catholic Church, which I really saw as a completion of my faith as a disciple, in the liturgy and everything that the church offered, we began to raise our family as not only as Catholics, but our children who are Jewish as Messianic Jewish Catholics, as Hebrew Catholics. And I can proudly say today that they, as young adults, 3 of them married, 2 of them with families, that they have a strong sense of their Jewish identity as Hebrew Catholics, and they are also raising their children as Catholics. So been able to continue on this Jewish identity and this belief in Jesus as the Messiah, as Yeshua. So thank you for listening. I cut out a lot, but I wanted to give you a sense of where I'm coming from and how important it is to me to be a Jewish believer in Jesus, the Messiah. Thank you.